Well, hello, hello, hello. Much love to you all. May God bless you all. Smash that like button, share this out. We're going to continue the Explain series as we go through explaining books of the Bible and certain aspects of the Bible that might be confusing to some people. There's a playlist I'll share at the end of this. If you've missed all the Explain series, we've done the Torah explained. We've done each book in the Torah separately explained. We've done the historical books explained, Revelation, and we're continuing to go on throughout all of this. So this will be the book of Joshua explained. So to start this study out, the Israelites stood at the edge of Canaan on the verge of claiming the promise that God had made to Abraham so long ago in Genesis 12:7. The task ahead was both exciting and it was sobering. Crossing the Jordan River and conquering the land possessed a serious challenge. Israel would have to drive out the strong people who lived in a well-fortified city, as the book of Numbers 13, verse 28 through 29 says. The Israelites stood at the end of one era and the beginning of another. Moses, Israel's great leader, had died, and Joshua had taken the leadership. This role carried great responsibility. And many probably wondered if Joshua had the necessary skills to complete the jobs that Moses had begun. The book of Joshua describes how the Israelites faced Canaan's challenge. They conquered the land and they divided it amongst the tribes. They succeeded because of Joshua's strong leadership, but mostly because God empowered Joshua for the task. Like Joshua, we face very great challenges, and we too can trust that the Lord will help us accomplish these for His purpose. So up on the screen, I'm going to read it to you guys, a little quick outline. One is Israel conquers the land, as you see in Joshua 1 all the way through Joshua 12:24. We can break this down as A, the preparations for conquest in chapter 1 all the way to chapter 5 verse 15. B, the central campaign, chapter 6 all the way to chapter 9 verse 27. C, the southern campaign, chapter 10 verse 1 through 43. D, the northern campaign, chapter 11 verse 1 through 15. And then E, we get a summary in chapter 11, verse 16 through chapter 12, verse 24. 2 would be Israel divides the land. We see this in Joshua 13 through Joshua 21:45. So we break it down as A, Israel's remaining challenges that they have to face in Joshua 13, verse 1 through 33. B, Israel's land inheritances in Joshua 14 through Joshua 19, verse 51. C, Israel's designated cities, you could put. We see this in chapter 20 through chapter 21, verse 45. And then finally, we can break it down in the third part. Israel begins to settle into the land. This is from chapter 22 through chapter 24. And we'll break it down as A, we see that there is a misunderstanding that almost leads to a civil war in chapter 22. B, Joshua's final challenges to God's people in Joshua 23 through Joshua 24, verse 27. And C, there's 3 burials that take place in chapter 24, verse 28 through 33. Okay, so let's look at a background of the book of Joshua. The book of Joshua, it continues the story from the Pentateuch. Deuteronomy ends with the account of Moses' death, and then Joshua begins with the words in the book of Joshua, now after the death of Moses. So God proposes for Israel to continue through Joshua. This was Moses' assistant and successor. So when we get to Joshua the man, we first see his biblical account recorded in Exodus 17, verse 9 through 14, where he leads the Israel Israelites' army over the victory of the Amalekites. We also find him at the foot of the Mount Sinai when Moses is receiving a law in Exodus 20, verse 13, and near the tent of meeting when God was meeting with Moses in Exodus 33, verse 11. The Lord used Moses to prepare Joshua to lead Israel. Later, Joshua was one of the 12 that would go to spy out the land of Canaan in Numbers 13. Joshua, along with Caleb, urged the people to take the land by faith, but a lot of the people didn't have faith. They were in fear, and this ended up in Numbers 14, verse 1 through 10, ultimately leading us to God's judgment on Israel to wander in the wilderness until all the unbelieving generation had passed away, except Joshua and Caleb, because they had faith. We can relate that to today. If you really want to make it, you have to have faith. If you don't have faith, you're not going to make it. Simple. So, as we continue through this, after bringing the people to the edge of Jordan, Moses died, and then Joshua led the people into the land. So, the date and authorship is always something that is a little bit of a question when it comes to the Bible. And we're going to give some of the closest evidence we possibly can. The events of the book of Joshua span approximately 20 years. And we adopt an earlier date for the Exodus from Egypt. Joshua would have covered a period about 1405 to 1385 BC. A 13th century date for the Exodus places Joshua's death a little before 1200 BC. So, who wrote it, and where's the evidence, you could say? Well, in Joshua 24, verse 26, it suggests that Joshua wrote at least part of the book, and Jewish traditions have named him as the author. But when we get to Joshua's death in Joshua 24, verse 29 through 31, this is, of course, obvious that someone else recorded this because Joshua would have already been dead. So we see a common phrase throughout the book of Joshua, and that phrase is "to this day." And this suggests that an extended amount of time has elapsed since the events described, but we don't have an exact time frame of it. We just, by assumption, to this day generally means that this is a little bit of a span of time here. So the mention of the Jebusites in Jerusalem in Joshua 15:63 suggests a date prior to 1000 BC, because when David conquered Jerusalem and drove out the Jebusites in 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 6 through 10, is where some people get this date as well. The reference to the Canaanites in Gezer in Joshua 16, verse 10 implies a date prior to about 970 BC when the king of Egypt conquered Gezer and gave it to Solomon. We see this in 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 1 and 1 Kings 9:16. So when we look at all this evidence, it seems reasonable to conclude that much of this book comes from an eyewitness account and even perhaps from Joshua's own hand. Either way, all of this was inspired by God and written. So, then we get to archaeology. And archaeologists have excavated many sites that the Bible says the Israelites conquered. Evidence from Jericho, we see, unfortunately, has proven largely inconclusive, but excavations at Lachish and Debrir and Hazor have revealed massive destruction layers from about the 13th century BC, which would go back to the date that we had. Scholars always argue, we bring this up in every Explained series, they always argue about this late date of the Exodus event because of this evidence. But other scholars, however, they have suggested that the archaeology or the archaeological evidence may favor an earlier date. Anyways, we know that the book of Joshua names 3 cities that the Israelites burned: Jericho, Ai, and Hazor. We see that in Joshua 6, verse 24, Joshua 8:28, and Joshua 11:11. So, evidence of the migration of other people into the land in about 1200 BC suggests these people, not the Israelites, may have destroyed many of towns and villages. We know there's many wars throughout the history of time. But archaeology offers many benefits to Bible students and backs up many things that the Bible says. They've even had evidence pulled up from the Red Sea parting, and that's why so many people try to debunk the Red Sea, because there's a lot of archaeology that actually proves that this happened. So, we see this theme in the book of Joshua. We see this transition of power from Moses to Joshua. Before Moses died, he commissioned Joshua in Deuteronomy 31, verse 3, 7 through 8, verse 14 and 23. The book of Joshua traces the development as Israel's new leader and shows God's approval of Joshua. Joshua became, in effect, like Moses to the people. Now, this same God who empowered Moses now empowered Joshua. We see that in Joshua chapter 1, verse 5, and Joshua chapter 3, verse 7. Amazing. So we see the biggest common theme in this is a conquest and a division of Canaan. And we see the book of Joshua contains two major sections. Chapters 1 through 12 describe Israel's conquest of the land. Chapters 13 through 24 describe Israel's division and the settlement of the land. The Lord had promised the land to Abraham hundreds of years ago in Genesis 12:7. Now he commanded Israel to destroy the land's inhabitants and take possession of it for themselves. This conquest of Canaan thus serves two purposes: to bring God's judgment against the people of the land, in Leviticus 18, verse 24 through 22, and we see it also in Joshua 11:21, and to bring his blessing to Israel. So, we see this Hebrew word. So here we get a very important Hebrew word that plays a very important role in our understanding of these battles, because sometimes God commanded Israel to destroy completely a nation that opposed him. So this word right here,
Strong's H 2764. Cherem. Cherem. And second entry, Cherem. Cherem.
it is net, a cursed thing, cursed thing, devoted, destruction, devoted thing, dedicated thing, destroyed. And of course, yes, we do see this in the book of Joshua. This word is being used. As we're looking at this word, it can be interpreted as spoils of war. And it, whether it be in people, animals, or goods, belonged to the Lord, and he had the right to do with it with whatever he wanted to do. So after Israel gained control of Canaan, the people divided the land east and west of the Jordan into tribal territories. However, Israel lacked the faith to drive out the remainder people. Joshua 13, verse 6 backs this up. This led to dire consequences, as you find out later throughout the book of Joshua and later throughout the Old Testament. So God's faithfulness to his promises, the Bible stresses that Israel's conquest and division of Canaan did not happen because of their military strength. Rather, it happened because of God's faithfulness. Joshua 21, verse 43 through 45 backs this up. And the Lord kept his promise to Israel just as he keeps his promise to us believers today, as 2 Corinthians 1, verse 20 says. So, the message of the book of Joshua. In chapters 1 through 12, we get Israel conquers the land. So we'll break it down like this. Chapters 1 through 5 is the preparations for the conquest. God appeared to Joshua after 30 days of mourning for Moses had ended in Deuteronomy 34, verse 8. The Lord challenged his new leader 3 times to be strong and courageous. Joshua chapter 1, verse 6, 7, and 9. So first, Joshua needed to focus on the task that laid before him, to lead God's people into the land. And second, he must remember his heritage and meditate on God's word regularly. The third is he must remember God's presence. The Lord was with him. Joshua then approached the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh in chapter 1, verse 12 through 18. Moses had granted these tribes permission to live on the Jordan's east side, but he had commanded them to help their fellow Israelites conquer Canaan in Numbers chapter 32, verse 28 through 32. So the tribes assured Joshua that he could count on their support. Joshua secretly dispatched 2 spies into Jericho in chapter 2, verse 1 through 24, and the spies entered the home of Rahab, a prostitute, and she hid them. So when this happened, then the king of Jericho heard of the Israelite men had come to Rahab's home. He ordered their arrest, but Rahab hid the spies and told the soldiers the men had already left. After this, Rahab had made a covenant with the spies. She had saved their lives, and now she asked for them to spare her. And Rahab affirmed her faith in the Lord, as well as the fright of the people of Jericho. The men agreed that if Rahab hung a scarlet cord from her window, the Israelite army would spare all within her home. They returned to Israel's camp and reported to Joshua everything that had happened. So then Israel crosses the Jordan River in Joshua chapter 3, all the way to chapter 4, verse 24. And this demonstrated God's hand on Joshua as their new leader. The winter rains had melted the winter snow and had caused the river to overflow its banks, but the Lord stopped the water, and the Israelites crossed on dry ground, just as they had done during Moses' days in Exodus 14. So Israel camped at Gilgal, and Joshua set up a pile of stones as a memorial where Israel had crossed. Future generations would then know where God had displayed his glory. Recently, these had got torn down not too long ago. So Joshua 3 and 4 illustrates 2 important principles. First, God sometimes takes us on a route we do not expect in order to display his glory. It seemed to make little sense to lead Israel across the Jordan when the people could have entered Canaan from the south and completely avoided the water, but God had other plans. As the people trusted the Lord's word, he worked a great miracle. Second, we must remember, we must pass the faith on to the next generation. We also see the book of Proverbs back this up. Train a child up in the way that they should go. Joshua established the stones for a future generation so they would see the power of God. What works of God have you seen in your life is the thing that you can pass on to others. So, keeping a written record of God's faithfulness in our lives provides a valuable encouragement amid difficult circumstances. And then we get to Joshua chapter 5. It describes 2 covenant memorials. The Israelites had neglected the practice of circumcision while they wandered in the wilderness, and God commanded them to perform the sign of the covenant on all their males. The people also celebrated Passover in the land for the first time, 40 years after they had left Egypt. And this was, of course, we remember during that time manna fell from heaven on which they had depended for their days in the wilderness in Exodus 16. And it also heralded a new beginning. Israel was home at last. See, Joshua was visited from a heavenly messenger in chapter 5, verse 13 through 15. Further linked him with Moses in Exodus 3:5 and encouraged him for the Battle of Jericho. God would fight for his people. So now we get to the central campaign in the book of Joshua, which is chapter 6 through 9. Israel's strategy was to divide and conquer by taking the central portion of the land first. This is a really bold way to go in any type of military campaign. But the central campaign included victories over Jericho, over Ai, and over Bethel, and a treaty with Gibeon. Now, of these, the battle with Jericho is the most famous. Everyone talks about this all the time, the marching around, the blowing of the ram's horn, the walls falling down. See, the Lord gave Israel particular instructions for conquering Jericho. And it seemed like you could not penetrate this walled city. It was a very fortified city, and the army was to march around the city once a day for 6 consecutive days, and the ark of the Lord was leading the way. The priests who accompanied the ark were to carry these ram's horns. And on the 7th day, the army was to circle the city 7 times with the priest blowing the ram's horns. When the ram's horns sounded, the people were to shout and God promised that the walls would fall down. And what happened after these instructions is exactly what happened. The miracle at Jericho illustrates another important spiritual principle. God often chooses to respond to his servants' faithful obedience. He sometimes may use our talents and our strengths, but most of all, he wants us to submit to his plans. See, the Lord commanded Joshua to destroy everything alive and give the plunder to him. Now, only Rahab and her family survived the battle. This was in accordance with the spy's promise. See, Rahab became part of Israel, but the Gospel of Matthew tells us something even more amazing. Rahab became an ancestor of Christ in Matthew 1:5. God's grace reached out to Rahab and not only made her part of God's family, but also used her to bring about the Savior of the world. Rahab's life shows how God's grace can reach all who are willing to humble themselves and to put their trust in him. See, with Jericho behind them now, the Israelites probably assumed no one could stand in their way. But Israel suffered a humbling defeat in the battle with Ai in Joshua 7, all the way to Joshua 8, verse 35. Joshua then inquired of the Lord and discovered that Israel had sinned. Someone had kept some of Jericho's treasures for himself. And the guilty party was to be revealed. And that guilty party, for his rebellion, he died for it. And also his family. So Israel then renewed the attack against Ai, and then they claimed victory. The people then journeyed north and renewed the covenant at Mounts Ebal and Gerizim as Moses had commanded. And this is in chapter 8, verse 30 through 35. And this also reflects on Deuteronomy 27, verse 11 through 26. So Gibeon, a major city of Canaan's central territory, quickly took steps to avoid the confrontation with Israel in Joshua chapter 9, verse 1 through 27, pretending to have come from a distant land. The Gibeonite delegation came to Gilgal and asked the Israelites to make a covenant with them. After agreeing to a covenant, the Israelites discovered that the Gibeonites lived in Canaan. And the good news was that Joshua had gained control of Canaan's strategic central plateau without a fight. It also meant that Israel had to cut the land in half and isolate the north from the south. So then we get to the southern campaign in chapter 10. And we see the coalition of the southern Canaanite kings quickly formed an attack on Gibeon, and the Canaanites had to stop one of the land's major players from going over to the invaders' side. Israel came to Gibeon's rescue, and the Lord used this occasion to rout these kings and to give southern Canaan to Israel. The Lord rained large hailstones on Israel's enemies and also answered Joshua's prayers to make the sun stand still. It's so amazing in chapter 10 when we read that. So after the Israelites prevailed, they continued fighting other southern cities and kingdoms. Then we get to the northern campaign. And we see the northern campaign is in chapter 11, verse 1 through 15. Another coalition was forming in the northern Canaan. Jabin, the king of Hazor, joined forces with other kings against Joshua's army. As in the southern campaign, Joshua's forces routed their foes and conquered their cities. Victory over the coalition led to continued victory over the northern cities, towns, and villages. We'll have to put a map up on the screen here to show you the northern campaign here. So in Joshua 11:15, this describes how Joshua completed the work that the Lord had given Moses. God commanded Moses to take Canaan. Moses entrusted the task to Joshua, and Joshua finished the job. The same God who worked through Moses now completed his work through Joshua. The same God also will enable us to complete whatever he calls us to do, and you best believe it. So then we get a summary statement, you could say. in Joshua chapter 11, verse 16, through Joshua chapter 12, verse 24, the Israelites had secured effective control of Canaan and the Transjordan. Although it seemed these many battles particularly happened overnight, Canaan's conquest actually required about 6 to 7 years. Israel's victory was really God's victory, for God used Israel as his instrument to judge Canaan's unbelieving people, as you see in Joshua chapter 11, verse 20. So then we get to Israel divides the lands in chapter 13 through 21. So Israel's remaining challenge in chapter 13, we see that the Israelites had already conquered the area east of the Jordan, but although they controlled Canaan, their task remained unfinished. Various peoples continued to inhabit Canaan's more remote areas, and Israel's individual tribes received the challenge to complete the conquest by exterminating these smaller groups. Now, we see that also this ended up, as the Israelites did not succeed in driving them out, they started adopting some of the pagan principles and practices that the people of the land had. So then we see in chapter 14 through 19, we see Israel's land inheritance. As Joshua begins to allot Judah's portion, Caleb stepped forward in chapter 14, verse 6 through 15. This man of faith had accompanied Joshua 45 years earlier when Moses had sent the 12 men out to spy on the land in Numbers 13 through 14, which we did a study, the Numbers explained, and it touches on some of this too. But only Caleb and Joshua had stood firm in their conviction that God would give Israel the land despite the obstacles. Now the two stood together at Gilgal, the only survivors from a generation of unbelief. These two men had seen it all. Caleb presented his own testimony. As he and the others had spied out the land, he had followed the Lord fully, as Joshua 14:8 says. And he was still following the Lord fully at the age of 85 years. So amazing. Caleb requested Hebron, vowing to drive out the inhabitants if God would give him victory. And God did give him victory. Caleb's life stands today as an example of faithfulness for all believers, even at the age of 85. Now, Joshua 14 through 19 describes how Joshua allotted the remaining tribes to their land's portions. As we see and study this, we'll know that Ephraim and Manasseh, the tribes that came from Joseph's sons, each received their own inheritance in Joshua 16 and 17. We also can relate this to Genesis 48, verse 21 and 22. In fact, Manasseh received the territory on both sides of the Jordan. The text mentions several tribes that could not or did not drive out the peoples inhabiting in their territory in Joshua 15, verse 63, Joshua 16, verse 10, Joshua 17, verse 12 through 13. The Israelites eventually accepted many of these people's religious practices and paganism, and this had a devastating effect on Israel's faith. So then we see that Israel had 6 cities of refuge, 3 on the west of the Jordan and 3 on the east of the Jordan. We see this in Joshua chapter 20, verse 1 through 9. We see that the Levites received 48 cities among the tribes. We see this in Joshua 21. So when Joshua had finished giving the tribes their land, the people gave Joshua his portion. And we get this in Joshua 19, verse 49 through 51. And Caleb's portion was the first allotted in Canaan, and Joshua's was the last. So these two men of faith forever leave their mark on those who inherited the land. Now, Israel's designated cities in chapter 20 and 21, The cities of refuge in chapter 20, verse 1 through 9, protected those who accidentally brought about someone's death. A person guilty of such an offense would remain at one of these cities until the high priest died. Joshua designated these 6 cities in fulfillment of Moses' instructions to Israel in Numbers 35, verse 9 through 15. The Levites had no land inheritance, as Joshua 21 states. Instead, God gave them 48 cities among the tribes, including the 6 refuge cities, as well as the surrounding pasture land on which to graze their animals. See, the Levites thus lived among God's people to help them with spiritual matters and also with disputes. See, this section closes with a testimony to God's faithfulness. In Joshua 21, verse 43 through 45, God fulfilled all his promises to Israel, and we could count on him to do the same today. Read the book of Hebrews chapter 13, verse 8. So then, to wrap up this study, Israel begins to settle into the land in Joshua 22 through 24. An early misunderstanding almost leads to civil war in chapter 22. After all of this had came to pass, after the 40 years of wandering, we see a civil war almost breaks out. The tribes of Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh had helped their fellow Israelites secure the land of Canaan, thus fulfilling their promise to Joshua all the way back at chapter 1, verse 16 through 18. Joshua dismissed them with his blessing and challenged them to remain faithful to God and his ways. But when the 3 tribes came to the Jordan, they built a large altar. And the other tribes heard of it. And Phinehas, Eleazar's son and Aaron's grandson, they led a delegation to investigate the matter. At first, it appeared that the eastern tribes were disobeying God's command to worship only where he said, as Deuteronomy 12:13 through 14 says, and the western tribes prepared to go to war against them. But the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh insisted they had built the altar on a sole testimony, solely on a testimony only. So, we see that this caused the civil war to not happen. And then we see Joshua's final challenges to God's people in Joshua 23 through Joshua 24. The book of Joshua preserves 2 of Joshua's final challenges to God's people. No doubt he also challenged them on many other occasions that the Bible may not tell us, and to tell them to follow the Lord with all their heart. His first speech comes up in chapter 23, verse 1 through 16, where he challenges Israel's leaders to remember the great things they had seen God do. He urged them to claim God's promise for the present and the future. God would drive out the remaining peoples and establish them in the land. God's people were to demonstrate their faith by keeping the law of Moses and not intermingling with the people around them. Of course, the Old Testament tells us what happens, but he also goes further to tell them if they failed to observe these things, Joshua warned them that they would perish. So in his second speech, we see in Joshua 24, verse 1 through 28, Joshua recounted Israel's history from the days of Abraham to the day they were at present. God had shown his faithfulness every step of the way. He had acted in history to redeem his people. He had sustained his people through difficult times in the wilderness, and he had dealt with his people totally by grace alone. Joshua exhorted the people to commit themselves fully to the Lord, adding his own personal testimony, as we read in Joshua 24, verse 15, "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." When the people affirmed that they would follow the Lord, Joshua made a covenant with them, and he put up a large stone as a testimony to their word. This covenant confirmed the prior covenants that the people had made at Mount Sinai in Exodus 24, and in Moab in Deuteronomy 29 through 31. It also gave the people another chance to proclaim publicly their allegiance to the Lord alone, as they had done earlier in the book of Joshua, chapter 8, verse 30 through 35. So as the book closes, we see 3 burials. In Joshua 24, verse 28 through 33. The book of Joshua closes with a record of 3 burials. Joshua died at the age of 110 years, and Israel buried him in his territory. God's people also buried the bones of Joseph, which they had brought from Egypt, as we read in Genesis 50, verse 24 through 25. Finally, they buried Eleazar, Aaron's son. With the burial of Joshua and Eleazar, another era in Israel's history ended. So, how well did Joshua do in preparing the next generation? Well, the answer is in Joshua 24, verse 31. Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua, and all the days of the elders who survived Joshua, and had known all the deeds of the Lord which he had done for Israel. So Joshua led the people by word and example, and entrusted God's message to faithful leaders who continued even after Joshua died. So verse 31 reminds us of an important task that the Lord has placed in our hands. As Christians, as followers of the Messiah, our part of our responsibility is to place the Christian faith firmly in the hands of the next generation. Are we ready to embrace a challenge like this as we are a generation in Revelation? We are in some times where we definitely need to entrust the word of the Lord into these children. Hopefully the book of Joshua was enlightening to you. At the end of this, you'll see pop up the Explain series. Many awesome things. We go through the first 5 books, the Torah, why do we study the Old Testament, the historical books explained, and now we did the book of Joshua. There's a book of Revelation. There's also a smaller part of book of Joshua that I did a couple years ago. That's why I wanted to remake this one, to make it longer than 6 minutes, to actually dig into it deeper as I've learned and observed more throughout my studies. So much love to you all. May God bless you all. And if you stood through the whole video, thank you from the bottom of my heart. It means a lot, as I have put about 2 to 3 months worth of time into this video. So much love, and may God bless you.